what is the importance, significance, relevance of Cholas in Indian history?
It is important for us to understand the Cholas because it shows us how power operated in a medieval society.
Indians have never conquered outside India except for Cholas.
If a king said it, it must have been true. Because as we know, politicians are the most reliable narrators of their own history. We are so focused on the Indianization of Southeast Asia, we don't talk about the Indianization of India itself.
What kind of skills it took for Cholas to become great administrators to build the power?
We romanticize empires so much, we are taught to feel bad when a medieval empire ends.
In India, we did not have this intersectoral or sectarian violence.
What the Shaivites and Vaishnavites said about each other in itself would get them jailed under hate speech laws today. The weight of the granite used is 49,000 tons. It is Sambian Mahadevi who is the founder of the Chola Empire.
Government of India officially, if you go to some Navy museum, they claim that the beginning of modern Indian Navy is from Shivaji.
Where are the depictions of Chola ships?
Hello, good evening. I don't need to introduce Anirudh, but I will. Okay. So we started this series of podcast last month. The first one was with Sam Darlimple. I think some of you were there online. The second one is with Anirudh. I so-called discovered Anirudh, I think in 2019, 2020 on Spotify. He used to do a very beautiful podcast called Echoes. And I spent very interesting time with that. Later on, he wrote a book on Deccan. I have the book with me. I actually, had he not written that book, I would have written, to be very honest, in some years. It's a fantastic book, Lords of the Deccan. It covers the history of Deccan as a geopolitical entity over a few centuries. And then I had a fanboy moment with him last year in Jaipur Lit Fest, which I'm sure you don't remember.
No, I remember. I remember.
So, yeah, and recently he has published this book called Lords of the Earth and the Sea, a history of the Chola Empire. And this is something that we want to talk about today. So Chola Empire is a part of our syllabus for both general studies and history optional as well. We generally in classes study the Nataraja Murtika architecture. We discuss the Dravidian style of temples. We have the typical MCQ on Uttaramuru inscriptions. We also discuss the Southeast Asian campaign. We'll discuss all of that today. But I'm sure that at the end of discussion, you will be very much amazed that how we look at the things very easily are not so easy, not so direct, not so obvious to us. So welcome, Anirudh.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'll start my first question is, Chola Empire started around 9th century, 8th, 9th century and went on for more than 400 years. In our syllabus, we call it early medieval. But you are a medievalist, so I'm not sure. Is it early medieval, medieval? What's the difference?
So, strictly, you can break the medieval into 2 or 3 big brackets. So, there is the early medieval, there is the high medieval, there's the late medieval. Now, when somebody is writing a long form non-fiction book, one of the things that is burned into my brain is something that my editor told me when I had submitted to him the beast of a manuscript that was Lords of the Deccan. So it was 140,000 words or something. And it was full of, I mean, keep in mind I was your guys' age. It was full of college humor and fart jokes. And as you can imagine, my editor did not like that at all. So he ghosted me for 6 months and then came back to me with a very clear memo. He said, look here, your competition is not other history books. Okay, so don't feel the need to compare yourself to the drier academic authors out there. Your competition is Netflix. You have to write a book that is so engaging and so easy to understand, that grabs attention at such a level that people feel that rather than closing the book and opening their phone and getting some dopamines, they want to turn the page and find what happens next. And in such a situation, you can't sit and explain to your readers what is early medieval, what is late medieval, why are you using early, why are you using late, what is the difference. That's something that you guys, I'm glad, have the capacity and the need to do. But when writing long form nonfiction, you've got to like balance all these different needs and compulsions. And so, yes, this is very much early medieval. Though, of course, I mean, when you look at the Chola Empire in the 12th century, there's a case to be made that it is really high medieval. But I don't, I find it,
Fanatic.
yeah, it's difficult for me to convince myself that it's important for the average reader with very little context to know that difference. In fact, I think most general readers don't even know the difference between ancient and medieval. A lot of people ask me, what does medieval mean in an Indian context? So, in that case, I think that the first thing for me to do is to establish that the medieval period is something that is distinct and worth understanding. And then hopefully in future works, I'll elucidate the difference and why certain polities, like Hoysalas, are absolutely a high medieval polity.
Yes.
The Delhi Sultanate is absolutely a late medieval polity. And the nuances of that, I think, need to be addressed in more specialized works. But for this book, at least, I thought that medieval was enough of a catch-all phrase to explain that difference.
Now, let me tweak the question a little bit.
Okay.
If your audience doesn't need to know what is the nitty gritty between early medieval, why would they need to know the Cholas themselves? What is the importance, significance, relevance of Cholas in Indian history at generic level, at larger, at big picture?
Well, I think the Cholas should be better understood simply because they are one of the better known South Indian dynasties and because they have left behind such a rich epigraphic corpus that is possible for us to understand Chola society, polity, economy with a depth and detail that is not possible for any other dynasty. So you would know this as somebody who enjoys reading about the Deccan. We can't answer some fairly basic questions about, for example, the Rashtrakuta Empire. We have very little understanding of, for example, Rashtrakuta tax regime because the Rashtrakutas are left behind practically like very limited inscriptions on stone compared to the Cholas. Most of what we know about the Rashtrakutas comes from copper plates, which are much more limited in number. But for the Chola period, we have an enormous corpus of, I think, nearly 13,000 inscriptions that I'm aware of. And these are inscriptions that are not just made by the royal family, but really by a huge cross section of Tamil society. And it's possible for us to trace out very nuanced and detailed historical trends. We can see trends in royal self presentation. We can see, even for example, and one of the big focuses of my book is really tax fraud. And the way that tax fraud contributed to the end of the Chola Empire. There is no other medieval polity for which we can do this. So, from my point of view, it is important for us to understand the Cholas because it shows us how power operated in a medieval society. And as citizens of a democracy, I think one of our fundamental obligations to each other is to be able to understand power. Now, whether we end up understanding how power works through behavioral sciences, through psychology, or whether we understand it through a study of history is really, I think, up to us. But for me personally, as a history nerd, I firmly believe that Cholas offer an extraordinary opportunity for fellow history lovers to understand this. And at a more banal level, I just think they're really interesting people. I think it is amazing to see how this relatively minor polity in what is essentially an agrarian backwater, because up till the 9th century, the Kaveri River Valley had not been home to any great empires. Today, we see it as a land of agrarian plenty, it's a great population center, but how did it come to be that way? And the answer has everything to do not just with the Chola dynasty, but with the larger society they're part of. I think we have a tendency in Indian society to really see history as a procession of kings and dynasties. And the richness of the Chola epigraphic record allows us to really challenge that. I can trace out for you how merchant corporations changed over the decades. I can trace out for you how trading goods changed over the decades. I can trace out for you the beginnings of private property in South India as a concept, thanks to the richness of Chola inscriptions. And all these are profoundly important questions for us to grapple with as a society.
One of the amazing things about Cholas that anybody knows of is the campaign in Southeast Asia.
Is there?
Campaign in the Southeast Asia.
Yeah. Yes.
So I read this chapter in your book, I think third chapter, in that you have detailed the entire campaign, and it was a shocker. First thing I want to ask you is that can you tell me the significance of the campaign overall in the global politics for Cholas, for the world? why it is so important, especially because I have heard this since childhood, maybe WhatsApp history or something, that Indians have never conquered outside India except for Cholas.
Yeah.
Is that what makes it very consequential?
Well, I think that if you draw a line on any part of the globe, some army would have gone across it at some point or the other. It is just an accident of history that we have happened to draw this line around India, and therefore we can conveniently ignore all the movements of armies within and come up with a somewhat ahistorical conclusion that Indians are never conquered. The fact is that this definition of Indians also needs to be questioned a little bit, because even if you were to look at Kashmir, for example, and you look at Lalitaditya Muktapida, it's pretty obvious that he did a lot of stuff in Central Asia, very much outside quote unquote India. But then why is Lalitaditya considered Indian but a Tibetan Buddhist king ruling in the 12th century isn't? Even because using similar rituals, using similar techniques to control his population, why is Lalitaditya Indian but not a Tibetan, right? But leaving that aside, now to come back to the Chola campaign in Southeast Asia in a global context, I think the really big change that results from that is there's a massive expansion in the Tamil diaspora presence in Southeast Asia. And that has profound implications for commercial history and for economic history. Um, the really intriguing thing to me, and use this interesting term of WhatsApp history, is that so much of our perception of the Cholas just comes from things that were declared in the early 20th century and that we never really came to question. And this happened well before WhatsApp was ever a thing. Now, the Southeast Asia campaign is so intriguing to me because if you read K.M. Panikkar very confidently declares that not only did the Cholas have a huge navy, but so did Srivijaya, which was the confederacy in Southeast Asia. And he then declares that there was 100 years war between the Cholas and Srivijaya. Where is Panikkar getting this idea from? Nilakanta Shastri. What Nilakanta Shastri read? Nilakanta Shastri says, okay, so here's this inscription where Rajendra Chola claims to have done such and such things. And Sastri is a little more critical than he's generally given credit for. He says that no, there's no evidence that Cholas ruled in Southeast Asia, but they must have had a strong naval policy to do all of these things that they claim that they did. Now, when you look at the actual evidence, now leave aside the, how do I put this? I think we tend to take epigraphs very, very seriously in India. If a king said it, it must have been true. Because as we know, politicians are the most reliable narrators of their own achievements, right? Now, the actual archaeological evidence and the epigraphic evidence from Southeast Asia is all about Tamil merchants. We have not found a single Chola inscription in Southeast Asia. Even the Tamil merchant inscriptions in Southeast Asia don't mention a Chola king. So why do we think that there was an overseas empire? All the evidence is telling us very clearly we have to look at the story of the diaspora. But since the received wisdom that was established in the early 20th century is it was an overseas empire, we have simply been repeating that ad infinitum all the way up to the present day. But leaving aside the nationalist assumption, when we start to think of what is the history of this Tamil diaspora, it is one of the most extraordinary stories in Indian history. Because it is not like other communities, other ethnicities, other linguistic groups did not have diasporas. Odias had some, Bengalis had some, a lot of Indian folks generally lived in Southeast Asia. But the Tamils had this amazing sense of community that was structured around temples. So in the 1980s, there were some preliminary excavations done at this place called Kota China, which is in northern Sumatra. And at Kota China, Tamil style temples have been found that conform in their dimensions, in their measurements, in their style, quite similarly to what you see in Tamil temples in Sri Lanka and on the mainland. And in the 13th century, there was also a Tamil temple built in Chuanzhou in southern China, the remains of which you can still see in the Maritime Museum. And even though the interpretation of the icons, so Tamil temples will have like a band of little lion figurine, leonine figurines called yalis. The yalis are rendered in this completely syncretic, like Chinese Persian style, but the idea, the concept still comes from the Dravida mode of architecture. And it is just bonkers to me to think that a diaspora could have such a clear sense of its identity that on the other side of the planet, when they're building a temple, even though the sculptural style is different, the architectural idea is the same. And the Tamil diaspora in inscriptions is present in Southeast Asia from as early as the 7th century all the way up to the 13th, 14th century. And that's even before the huge expansion and like immigration that begins in the colonial period. And these guys were trading in pretty much everything. To think and to think of the scale of their networks, to think of the variety of the goods they were sourcing, and to think this was tied to a temple economy really challenges the ways that we can think about capitalism, about economic history, about commercial history, even about diaspora histories. So by I think this emotional, this romantic, this nationalist compulsion that we have to look up to our kings and to see kings as the protagonists of Indian history is a profound injustice to our past. We have deeply damaged our relationship with our ancestors and our ability to understand the big picture of Indian history by focusing so much on these singular, muscular, royal figures. Once we allow them to somewhat recede from the center stage, we uncover a history that is not just incredibly rich, but also that represents our contemporary society a lot better. Because how many of us would obey an order given to us by our local MLAs? Show of hands? Not a single person. Yeah, but when you think about people of the past, oh, they must have loved their kings. They must have worshipped their kings. People are so loyal to their kings. Where are these assumptions coming from? They're not born out by anything that we are seeing. The history that we are told to repeat does not explain the way that our society works today. And so we have to really complicate our understanding of the past.
So, Anirudh, I think in the nutshell, the main point was the cultural impact was more profound than the political impact of the Chola Empire on Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
But was it unidirectional? Because I remember one episode in Bharate Khoj long back that when Chola king wants to build a temple, somebody from Southeast Asia gifts some model of a temple. And based on that, he thinks, okay, I need to build a temple here. So I think historically it might not be very accurate because I have not seen any reference to that anywhere.
Yeah.
But is there any evidence of reverse cultural flow from Southeast Asia to Tamil Nadu? It's just a
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess it kind of depends on how do you define cultural flow. Let me give you an example. Now, when we think of Southeast Asian scripts, how many of us have heard this idea that Southeast Asian scripts are derived from the Pallava script? I'm guessing a fair few of us have heard of that. But when you actually study and interrogate that, you realize that it's actually not a very accurate description at all. There's this fantastic paper by Arlo Griffiths, who is an epigraphist, on the scripts of Southeast Asia, and he points out that a lot of Southeast Asian scripts appear to be impacted by different early forms of Brahmi. Some seem to be inspired by Siddham script, some seem to be inspired by the Pala script. Only a few of them seem to have any connection to the so-called Pallava script, which is better described as a variant of Southern Brahmi. So what Southeast Asia is taking from India, these so-called cultural flows are actually very selective, and there's a lot of agency in the Southeast Asians in what they're choosing to engage with, how they're choosing to interpret it. Now, and I understand why it is very often thought of as Indian or Indic cultures, but that's not actually what we're seeing. We're seeing very specific parts of India with specific ties to Southeast Asia being picked up by Southeast Asian kingdoms. And the bigger question that we're also not fully understanding is we are so focused on the Indianization of Southeast Asia, we don't talk about the Indianization of India itself. How did Indian culture as we understand it come to develop? What's actually happening here? It's a really complicated process where some modes of kingship which are being established in northern India under the Gupta Empire are then selectively being picked up in some parts of the Deccan, in some parts of South India, and simultaneously in some parts of Southeast Asia. The earliest Indic kingdoms in Southeast Asia are the contemporaries of the Pallava kingdom in South India. So why is it that Southeast Asians are being Indianized, but the Pallavas are not being North Indianized? You know, what we're talking about is a very it's much more akin to an early form of globalization than anything else, right? So now let's talk a little bit about cultural flows. We have been so trained in India to look for vague parallels in Southeast Asian art and architecture and to think this must have come from here, that we are completely blind to the idea that some things must have gone the other way as well. And I think that most of these flows came not in the form of easily traceable architectural sculpture, but mostly in the form of texts, in the form of perishable icons that don't leave that much of an archaeological trace. And I'll give you a very simple example. You all may have heard of Atisha Dipankara. He was the Buddhist teacher who spread Buddhism in Tibet. Born in Bengal, studied in Vikramashila, but he completed his studies in Sumatra. He went to Sumatra to get his final accreditation as a important Buddhist teacher, and then goes to Tibet and then spreads that. So is he spreading Bengali Buddhism or is he spreading Sumatran Buddhism? Can we even use those terms in this period? Do they even apply? Or is there like a more broad-based, multi-centric, like Eastern Indian Ocean Buddhist culture that Atisha is then taking and transplanting into Tibet, which in Tibet again it's going through its own things in the 11th 12th centuries, right? The rise of lamas and of monasteries as political centers. So the absorption of these ideas once again is very selective and very contextualized to the local political needs. So I know that isn't a direct answer to your question, but the point I'm making is I think the question itself is in a way overly simplistic, right?
Agreed. Coming back to this role of merchants, I think the early medieval had a lot of merchant guilds. One is Anjumanam, Nanadeshi, Manikramam, the 500, etc. And you have focused a lot on the 500 and its role. So when I read the description, I understood that the merchants guilds are very powerful. They have huge economic footprint across Indian Ocean. They engage in multiple commodities, import, export, if I can use these terms. They have money. They use sometimes military to safeguard their commodities. They sometimes kill people using mercenaries as well. So they have everything that is required to create a state in a way, and they collaborate with the kings also. Why did they never choose to become kings themselves? It's just a hypothetical question. If you are such a big corporation, if you have so much power, why to remain dependent on somebody else?
So you're going to get very annoyed at me for like picking apart the questions before giving you an answer. But we assume that because all these different people are calling themselves the Ainutruvar, the 500, that they have a consolidated leadership, which I don't think was the case. I think these are all like very amorphous, like franchises. They're all calling each other, they're calling themselves by the same name, but in practice, they're operating independently. But more importantly, when you say state, we are assuming that there is a clear delineation between the king and his court and the rest of society, which isn't actually the case. I think a better way to think about it is state society, in that there is a ruling class that shares a lot of behaviors, and power is shared between multiple centers. It is not concentrated in royal courts, right? So the merchants. So you're talking about these mercenary activities. Now, I'll just give you guys an example so you have a little bit of context, right? There's this crazy inscription from Banavasi in Karnataka that talks about the merchants of the Ainutruvar. They have found out that some local guy or some local group was responsible for killing one of their members. So they hire a fellow called Revanna, who's a local merchant, and they tell him, go after the guys who killed our fellow. Revanna kills, I think he kills 4 men and 2 children and drinks their blood and then comes back. And the Ainutruvar give him a title. They call him the Foe Destroyer or something dramatic like that. And they give him preferential tariff rates and they welcome him by giving him a betel leaf. They give him pan basically. How many of you guys have heard there's this Bombay crime slang? And they say that when a hit job is put on someone, they say that a supari has been put on him. You know? So where does that come from? It comes from not just medieval courtly behaviors, but medieval aristocratic behaviors. That pan is given to the loyal vassal or military general of a king. Now here we are seeing a merchant group using what is ostensibly a royal behavior. They are to give a preferential tax rate, to give a title. These are all royal behaviors. Now, what is the difference then between a merchant and the state? There really isn't a clear delineation. So if merchants are already doing all the things that kings are doing, just at a smaller scale, what is the need for them to take over the court, right?
The idea of sovereignty was not so.
Exactly. Sovereignty is shared. That is how it worked. It was not just merchants, by the way. Temples also shared in some aspects of royal behaviors.
I'll come to temples in some time.
Sure.
But before that, picking a cue from this only, UPSC has asked this question in the past, that Cholas were the great builders and the great administrators. Now, focusing on the second part, the great administrators. When the sovereignty is shared among so many actors in the elite group, what kind of skills it took for Cholas to become great administrators to build the power?
So there's a very interesting book by Y. Subbarayalu, who was one of the great epigraphists and scholars of the Cholas, where he has collected a bunch of his papers together. And one of these papers, he actually set himself the task of figuring out how on earth this Chola bureaucracy worked. Right. So this is a sprawling empire, right? Like north to south is probably around 1,000 kilometers, and it rules over peoples who speak not just Tamil but also Telugu, Kannada, early forms of Sinhala. So how big do you think the bureaucracy of the Cholas must have been? Any guesses? Any wild guesses? You think they operate through feudal lords? Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's okay. That's a good answer. But the court itself must have had guys to keep track of like revenues coming from agriculture and so on, right? To look after big projects like temple building, that sort of thing. So how many people do we need to organize that? Shall we say 10,000? Yeah, that's a reasonable guess. Does everybody agree? 10,000 is reasonable. Subbarayalu combed through all the Chola inscriptions and he found 100 named bureaucrats. At the peak, the largest number of bureaucrats under one king was 100. Most kings had less than 100 guys trying to hold together this absolute mess of different polities, different peoples that had suddenly been absorbed into a huge sprawling empire, right? So that in itself should give you a little bit of sense of how the empire operated. Now, medieval empires are not like modern empires. Modern empires had bureaucracies, they had gunpowder, they had telegraphs, they had logistical abilities that allowed them to forcibly control huge populations. Medieval empires weren't like that. Medieval empires are falling apart as they were being built. Not just the Chola Empire, but even the Mughal Empire, the Delhi Sultanate. As they're expanding, they're falling apart. So there's constantly a process of push and pull. Now, Chola administration was, to me, is so fascinating because it is as much about convincing people to pay taxes as actually collecting the taxes, right? Because your bureaucracy is so limited, your communication networks are relatively rudimentary compared to what we have today. Your ability to extract resources in terms of rice, in terms of manpower, depends on how many people you can convince that your rule is righteous. How do you do that? You have to project your authority somehow, and the way the Cholas did this was through temples. So it is amazing to see how there's this particular thing called the Meikirti. So the Meikirti is the prologue to a Chola king's dedicatory grant. And the Meikirti contains all the information how amazing the king is at conquering, how generous he is in giving out gifts and titles, and how devoted he is to the god, right? And seasonally, campaign after campaign, the Mekirtis would be updated and sent out by the court, and various Chola, either officials or people who had worked in a Chola military campaign or bore a Chola title, would then take that Mekirti and add it to their temple gifts, right? So there's a very decentralized process happening, but through all these temples, essentially the same message is being sent out of the Chola king is righteous, he protects his subjects, he defeats his enemies, and he is generous to all the gods. And his officials and the people who are loyal to him are also generous to the gods. All right. So that is one aspect of it.
So propaganda. If you can use
Your
the-
words, not mine. So that is one aspect of it, and the other aspect of it is now you have this like enormous plurality of different people who are loyal to you in different ways. How do you get them to pay taxes? And that's where I think the administrative brilliance of the Chola court comes in. And that especially if you look at Rajaraja Chola, this guy seems to have had a unbelievable, unending appetite for just working through the most. I mean, I don't find administration, differential tax rates for different crops, different lands, figuring out the plot sizes of like different temples, who owns what in which village. I don't find them interesting. Maybe you guys do, since you're going to be future IAS officers. But Rajaraja Chola also did. There is, in the inscriptions, you can see that he took a persistent and consistent interest in figuring out these things, in converting pre-existing land measurements to the new standard rates that were coming out of his code, establishing standard weights, etc., etc. All the things that mark out like true, serious, centralized administrations. The fact that the empire is expanding so quickly that this apparatus could not spread rapidly enough is a separate matter, and was a fundamental issue with the empire that later bit his descendants in the bottom. But the impulse to administer was there. So that is why I consider them to be, I mean, at least by the standards of the early medieval period, pretty remarkable administrators.
So this administration is not about what we see today as administration.
Yeah.
It's a different kind of adjustment going on all the time.
Yeah.
Through some use of religion, through some use of propaganda or some publicity.
Exactly.
Etc. And some bureaucratization along the way.
Yeah.
Now, so they must have faced off with the what we glorify today as local self-government in the Chola era.
Yeah.
So we have in our syllabus this Uttaramirud inscriptions we study all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think some of the books are still not updated. They call it from Chingalpur district.
Yeah.
Even today.
Wow. That's really out of date. Yeah.
So these names have changed. Bifurcation has happened. Today it's Kanchipuram district.
Yeah.
So and we study that what are the qualifications, disqualifications, the functions of the committee, how the elections used to take place, etc. But my question is, so these local assemblies of people, either in Brahmin village or other villages, etc., they must have held fast to their own rights, their own authority, their own control over local resources. And here comes a Chola emperor who wants to administer things, who wants to enhance his power, who wants to centralize a lot of functions. So they must have clashed somewhere. How did this clash play out?
Well, it kind of depended on the relative power of the state at different points of time. So under Rajaraja, for example, the state is a juggernaut, because there's this endless tide of conquest, this tide of wealth that is coming that allows the presence of the king to be felt through temples across a big chunk of his empire. So there's really no getting away from him. And the other really intelligent thing that Rajaraja Chola did is that he appointed his own guys to keep an eye on temple affairs, right? And then what he'd do is he would say, I am gifting the lands of such and such village to this temple. So what's going to happen? If the lands are technically still under the control of the local assembly, but they've been gifted to the temple where Rajaraja's officer is sitting to handle things, right? So there is a certain degree of control, charisma, coercion that may or may not have been applied in all these places. But when the conquests start to slow, when the tide of manpower and the tide of resources is not in the favor of the Cholas, then very quickly the local assembly asserts itself. And how? By 1050, under the grandsons of Raja, local assemblies have decided that by themselves they don't have enough leverage against the Chola state. So they start to form super assemblies. One of the most remarkable medieval organizations called the Chitrameli Periyanadu, which means the shining plow of the great Nadu. So Nadu basically was the smallest unit of local government. And the Chitrameli is composed not just of cultivators, it also includes Brahmins, it has some merchants. So essentially, all the moneyed elements, all the guys with capital, with influence across a bunch of different regions are coming together and saying, you know, we are going to tell the Cholas how much tax we are going to pay. And not just that, over the next few centuries, as the relative power of the Chola state continues to decline, these organizations become the basis of new caste coalitions. So huge groups of people from various backgrounds start to coalesce into these larger organizations. They start to take decisions on caste hierarchies, on local judicial matters, on temple taxation, on land taxation, all these different things. And beyond a point, they become the default. People start to go to them for justice rather than to any representation of the king. The Idangai and Valangai formations, the twofold bifurcation, the horizontal bifurcation of Tamil society, directly stems from these kinds of super assemblies, not from anything the Cholas were doing. Though, I mean, there is an indirect amount of Chola influence in that these assemblies actually form from members of the Chola army who had such a strong regimental identity even after leaving the army that they then went on to like form assemblies and so on and so forth. So it's amazing to me how much political activity was actually done by collectives in a period that we generally associate with royal autocracy. And I find that tremendously inspiring because I think very often we either take away a very romantic lesson from Indian history that kings are so great, never question royal authority, or we take this, I think, an equally problematic assumption where we think that every town was like Uttaramerur that was like so autonomous and the kings didn't do anything to them and they could just do whatever they wanted. The truth is obviously somewhere in between. But the more fundamental point is we talked about merchant assemblies earlier. Now we're talking about like caste assemblies, we're talking about cultivator assemblies. There is so much about medieval India was structured around collective decision making. Individual identities did not matter as much as which group are you a part of. And of course, tragically, that also feeds into notions of caste. But as long as our focus is only on the kings, it is difficult for us to understand why was it that caste was so fundamental? How would it become so ingrained into Indian society? And once you connect medieval caste to medieval politics, then it becomes less surprising that caste and politics are still so tightly bound together today. Very often, the claim that we are the world's largest democracy kind of ignores the fact that I understand it's a bit futile saying this to IAS aspirants. You probably know this better than I do. But Indian elections fundamentally have been reduced to castes jostling to get their guy into the institution of power, so he'll help out the guys of their caste or their position in the social hierarchy. But there's a really very ancient impulse, and if we really want to be serious about being the world's largest democracy, we can't do that by hand waving these notions about, oh, our ancestors had local self government. We have to understand just how deep and ancient the connections between caste, power, and collective identity are.
Recently read somewhere how the resident welfare associations are becoming powerful in different urban parts of India. In Delhi, in Bangalore, in Gurgaon, it's run more by RWs rather than by the municipality or local people. So that also is a kind of a continuation of.
Absolutely, that's a fantastic example. That's exactly what's happening.
So, coming back to the main theme, so one of the ways by which the king would enhance the influence is by implanting, if I can use that verb, temples in different regions. That's what you said just now. So if I use today's political language, is it like politics is using religion? Because
Partially,
you have said that
but
somewhere in the book also.
it's also the other way around. In that religious institutions are also in India very happy to make alliances with politicians to achieve whatever their goals are. And we can see that in the great 21st century proliferation of godmen. I think that once again, it is very clear that there are medieval antecedents to this process. And we are being overly romantic if we assume that people of the past were incapable of weaponizing religion and politics the way that we do. The and this is what fascinates me so much about this period, right? Is that the people of 1,000 years ago are equally capable of these remarkable feats of engineering and innovation, the highest aspects of the human spirit, but are equally capable of this like absolute like brutal like skullduggery. They can be greedy, they can be corrupt, they're capable of making these really underhanded deals just to grab power, and they're capable of building institutions that survive for hundreds of years, but also coming to like really weird arrangements that end up oppressing people for century after century that we lack the clear sightedness to be able to address today.
So taking you from that again, you said that they built a lot of institutions. They tried to build sometimes. Like temple is one such institution. So in our syllabus, we study again and again that in the medieval time, the temples used to be centers not only of religion and spirituality, but also acted as economic centers, of social centers, political centers, banking, everything. So can you give us a sense of how the temple institution operated in Chola Empire?
Well, you've asked me to summarize the entirety of Chola history for you, which that is how important the temple is to the society we're talking about. But let me give you just a snapshot. So in the 12th century, so this is when the tide of conquest has completely faltered, and essentially after decades and decades of going to war, the military machine is completely exhausted. In order to conduct any sort of military campaign, the Chola kings are forced to rely on local chieftains who will mobilize manpower for them. So keep in mind the process I outlined for you, right? Where the wealth of conquest was used to project the king's charisma through temples. Now, what happens when the king doesn't have the resources to do that anymore? The local chieftains are going to do it, right? So the tax burden on local communities is constantly increasing. The Cholas are demanding more and more taxes. Villages are being driven into bankruptcy. They have to sell their lands to pay the taxes. Who are the only guys who have money left? The local chieftains. Right? So these guys start to muscle in, they start to buy up a whole bunch of properties. But they would have to pay tax on these properties. How do they avoid doing that? They give to temples. They say that, oh, this is a Devadana, this is meant for the god. We are paying the small lump sum up ahead to make it tax free, and we're going to have our guys cultivating the land, paying us a share of the revenue, and paying a share of the revenue to the temple, which is also controlled by our guys. Right? So essentially, this mechanism of political charisma is, which was once dominated by the king, is now taken over by the local chieftains. So now what happens in temples? Multiple people realize that temples can be a way to avoid paying taxes. So there's an explosion in the prosperity of temples. You begin to see new gateways added to temples, new compound walls being added. And you also see temples, like I said, indulging in royal behaviors, and that they will give titles to local people. So it becomes a way for people to climb the socio-economic ladder by giving gifts to temples. And the end result is, of course, the Chola tax system is fatally weakened. The ability of the Chola center to extract taxes disappears over the next few decades. On the other hand, temples become these great urban centers because so many people are making gifts to them. And they become great social centers because it is a place for political activity to happen for multiple groups to make claims to proximity to the god to rise up in the political ladder. So is this a good thing or a bad thing? We romanticize empires so much, we are taught to feel bad when a medieval empire ends. But if not for the rise of temples, the fall of the Cholas could not have happened. And this just exemplifies to me just how messy history is, right? We think that the rise of empires is about the rise of temples, the fall of empires is the fall of temples, but sometimes also the other way around. And it's only when you understand just how contradictory these medieval people were that you can really begin to grasp why temples are the way they were and why they're integrated into society the way they are.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, coming from temple to religion itself, uh, we had this controversy, I think, a year or 2 years ago, about the religious identity of Cholas.
Mm.
We have Kamal Hassan saying Cholas were not Hindus, and Maharaja Karan Singh replied that it is like saying that Shaivas are not Hindus. It means they're Catholic but not Christians.
Hmm.
So it doesn't make any sense to him. So, what is the religious identity of Cholas then?
So Kamal Hassan has this great ability to say something or the other that will get him in the news when some movie is coming out. So let us not take Kamal Hassan too seriously, but I think he comes from, there is a particular, I would say, really a Dravidian interpretation of the Cholas that sees them, I would say, in a rather historically inaccurate way, right? The assumption is that Tamil civilization and Tamil culture is so perfect. There could be no caste discrimination, there could be no blind devotion, there could be no bigotry until foreigners came and messed up this pristine culture. And this is a way that a lot of chauvinist, a lot of culturally superior movements are built. I will not say that this is exclusive to Tamils. We can see it happening at a much grander scale with religious identities today as well, which is why this comment landed Kamal Hassan in such hot water. I would say it really depends on how do we think about medieval Hindu identity. What is medieval Hinduism? If we focus purely on temple gifting, if we focus purely on the way that the Cholas presented themselves, the way they presented themselves within society, then yes, they absolutely do conform to what we imagine as Hindu. And it's kind of absurd to me how much historical denial has to go into this idea, right? So the idea that Cholas aren't Hindus also connected to the idea that Cholas didn't practice caste discrimination. When there are so many Chola inscriptions talking about land being gifted to Brahmins, when there are so many inscriptions talking about landless people like Parayar being sold pretty much into bonded, indentured labor, in some cases by Chola kings like Rajaraja III, one of the last kings. So I know it doesn't directly answer the question, but I think it, because like I said, medieval identities are so, like, just today actually one of my lovely commenters on Instagram who are always full of the best questions and the best inputs on history asked me, are the Cholas Tamil or Telugu? Now, how do I answer the question? Like, here are these guys who are like using Sanskrit in a lot of their inscriptions, but who are also using Tamil, but some of whose ancestors are Telugus. Like, we tend to assume that medieval people had these very simplistic identities that map perfectly onto our contemporary identities. But why? Like, if I'm speaking English, does that make me British? Like, where is the capacity for medieval people to be multiple things at the same time, the way that we are multiple things at the same time? Why this insistence on shoehorning them into our contemporary culture wars? Why can't a Chola king have been a Chola king? Why does he have to have been a Hindu king? Why does he have to have been a Tamil king? Why does he have to have been a Telugu king? They belong to a different time whose identities could have been so complex and multi-dimensional that we'll probably never fully understand them. It's, I think, is one of the most futile and pointless exercises to get caught up in this. Yeah, it just seems striking me a completely ahistorical thing that is done primarily to manufacture social media points. It is not a valuable contribution at all to any historical discourse.
So there is this saying called "past is a foreign country."
Yes, it is. It is
Yeah.
a foreign country.
So again, continuing the same thing, how would you look at the sectarian relationship in the Chola era. For example, we often hear of Shaiva versus Vaishnavas, or Cholas, as you have written very well, destroying some Buddhist stupas in Sri Lanka, or there is the issue of Shaivism versus Jainism. So, because in my childhood, at least as I was growing up, I always heard these stories that in India we did not have this intersectoral or sectarian violence, as we call in North India or in Urdu, firqa parasti. We don't have that. Uh, we have philosophical differences, and we may have debate and shastrarth, but we don't kill each other on the basis of these philosophical differences. But in the book, you have given a lot of very interesting stories about that as well. So, how was the sectarian relationship in Chola? How did that landscape? How did it work out?
So this is exactly what I'm talking about. As I said earlier, like we assume that the people of the past were not human beings, right? Every day they woke up to impart a moral lesson to us living 1,000 years later. Like, of course, they were capable of being greedy, of like killing people over property, and there is inscriptional evidence for this. Um, in the 13th century, for example, we have a really interesting inscription from Tirumayam, which is in the southern part of Tamil Nadu, and it tells us that this Hoysala general had to come to a town because the Shaivites and Vaishnavites had devolved into such a terrible dispute that they had taken each other's idols and thrown them into the temple tanks. So the general comes, he spends like a week there, breaking his head listening to all these arguments over whose property was given to which temple by which person in what year. He sits down and finally rationalizes everything. He says, these are the Vaishnavites' properties, these are the Shaivites' properties. Shake hands and be friends. And to seal the deal, you get each other's idols out from the temple tanks and put it back inside. And they agreed to this. But this one aspect of the story, the bigger aspect of the story that we are not talking about is what did the Shaivites and Vaishnavites think of the Jains and the Buddhists? And the evidence of the acrimonious hate, the incandescent hate that these guys had for these so-called heterodox sects is unbelievable to see. The kind of vile adjectives, pretty much medieval hate speech that was being used. And what I find really amazing is that what the Shaivites and Vaishnavites said about each other in itself would get them jailed under hate speech laws today. I'm not even kidding. I'm not exaggerating. Like, I will not give you examples because I don't want to be arrested. But just let's look at what the Bhakti poets have to say about each other's gods. But that pales in comparison to what they said about Buddhists and Jains. Not that Buddhists and Jains were shrinking violence; those guys said equally vile stuff about Hindu deities. But this the philosophical discussions would easily have landed them into like terrible trouble today. So take from that what you will, as far as our intellectual freedom is concerned. But this is really interesting 11th century Tamil Buddhist text called the Veeracholiam, which is a Buddhist grammar, and it mentions a whole bunch of other Tamil Buddhist texts that have disappeared. There is no sign of them. They have not survived the centuries. The town of Nagapattinam, the port of Nagapattinam, enormous amounts of Buddhist bronzes were found there in excavations, which are scattered in museums all across India. Not a single Buddhist monastery has survived. We have barely a handful of land grants made to Buddhist monasteries. Where did Tamil Buddhism go? I don't know. Was it persecuted? Was it violently obliterated? Did it fade away? Who knows? But was sectarian conflict involved in this? I think the evidence points us in that direction. And that's to say nothing of Tamil Jainism. There is amazing, I say amazing from a historical interest point of view, but really tragic if it was an accurate description of events. There's an incident where the Tamil saint Sambandar has a debate with Jains. Of course, since it's written in a Shaivite source, the Jains start all this. The Jains attack Sambandar. They set his monastery aflame. Some people are injured, or I think they're killed as well. And then Sambandar challenges them to a debate. And the Jains are so confident that they will win that they say, "Hey, if you win the debate, we'll impale ourselves." Which is something that, of course, people do. You lose an argument, you go and kill yourself brutally. But supposedly, Samandar wins the debate, and the Jains, true to their word. In fact, the Jains don't want to do it, but the king says that no, you guys said this, so you bloody well are going to kill yourselves. A lot of Shaivite temples depict this sculpture, and it's quite grisly. In fact, in some Shaivite temples in Tamil Nadu, even today, there are these stakes that are celebrated as being, oh, the stakes where the Jains impaled themselves. Now, was this an actual historical event? I really hope not, because it would be a terrible tragedy if it was. But the point is that it's a part of the cultural memory of Shaivites. It shows up in 9th century texts, it shows up in 12th century texts, continues to be present in ritual contexts even today. Could this have come from a philosophical debate? Some people will tell you it did. I would like to believe it did. I'm not so sure. And this is not the only example either. In the 12th century, in the Deccan region in North Karnataka, when the early Veerashaiva religion begins, there are a lot of Veerashaivite leaders who claim to have destroyed Jain temples. If you look at the Basava Purana, if you look at inscriptions, there are these guys who claim to have pounded and pulverized the Jain figures. In some temples, even today, you go to Lakundi and North Karnataka, you will see Jain temples where the Jinnah has been removed and a Shivalinga has been kept. Huh? The Brahmajinala, yeah. Now, this is a result of philosophical discussion. Let's be very clear. This happened because of a philosophical discussion, right? Here we are devoting so much attention to Hindu and Muslim conflicts. I'm not saying they didn't happen, absolutely did. But why do we assume that some religious communities are somehow immune to this impulse to direct violence against others? It is the nature of power. It is the nature of medieval power, and it is the nature of modern power. It is very easy for the powerful to direct anger at the other. It is the eternal political strategy to get out of any sort of accountability. Now, whether we can see it happening today or not, I will leave you to come to your own conclusions. But all I will suggest to you is don't assume that the people of the past were somehow immune to this impulse.
Let us come to some more positive aspects of the
sure.
of the past now. I have two questions before we open the floor. One is about the Buddheshwara temple and other about Nataraja Murti. So about the temple first. So in Tanjore we have this great, I think, I don't know Tamil, but they call Periya Kovil,
Yeah.
I guess. So it's a big temple. And you have mentioned in detail in your book about the engineering side of the temple. So how marvelous it was as an engineering project. So can we please, like, we study in our syllabus Dravidian architecture, how it evolved from Pallava era to Chola era, from Chola and Pandya, and then Nayaka era, etc. We discuss those things, but we look at it more from the point of view of how the form is evolving. We don't discuss the engineering side of it. But I found that section very interesting here. So can you please speak on that for some time?
So I mentioned earlier how we have this very text-focused, inscription-focused way of thinking about the past. And I think this is also one of the shortcomings of our study of architectural history, is that we look too much at the texts and the shastras, and we say that everybody is simply following the texts. I think it strips medieval engineers of their brilliance. If they're simply following the wisdom of great ancestors who wrote the scriptures, I think it ignores what the architectural record is also telling us. When you actually look at temples, not just Dravidian temples, but generally medieval temples, you can see there is a clear process of experimentation and the accumulation of new knowledge generation after generation. And keep in mind, what do we know about medieval education systems? We have very clear records of Brahmin education, right? We know that lots of large land grants were made for Brahmins, for Brahminical learning, but we don't really have that much evidence of how other communities handled education. I definitely think that some architects received quite advanced training in geometry and mathematics, But I don't think that their idea of engineering worked the same way as our idea of engineering. I think a lot of medieval engineering came from rules of thumb, experimentation, this practical knowledge that is being passed down through workshops, through family lines. And then at some point, it is being, these architects are also interacting with courtly intellectuals who are then compiling texts like the Shilpa Shastras, the Manasara, the Samarangana Sutradhara, that sort of thing. Now, when you look at the Brihadishwara temple, what is absolutely mind-boggling is that up till that point, Tamil temples were maybe, let's say, about twice the height of this room. And in the course of a single generation, they went from temples of like 20 feet tall to this absolute behemoth that is, it's taller than the Leaning Tower of Pisa, which took 300 years to build, mind you. And they built the Brihadishwara temple in about like 10 years max. They built the entire Vimana. So how the hell did that happen? I think that they knew that for a certain size of the base, you can build a Vimana to a certain height. For a certain thickness of wall, you can build the Vimana to a certain height. The basic engineering principle is actually quite simple. They're just expanding it to an unbelievable scale because now they have a huge amount of resources available to them. So the basic idea is you have a really thick wall, okay, and you have a hollow pyramid inside, right? Now this hollow pyramid, by itself, a pyramid is fairly stable, right? But it's not a perfect structure. It's not completely immune to like seismic forces. Because it's hollow, it can easily fall apart. And it is absolutely unreasonable to build a solid pyramid. That would take a enormous amount of resources and time. So what's the solution? They put something really heavy on top, and that locks the hollow pyramid onto the base. So now the pyramid can't move no matter what the hell happens. And it is actually mind-boggling how simple it is, but the execution of it must have required a extraordinary logistical apparatus. I think there's a fantastic study done by the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts, I think back in the 1970s. The volume of the Vimana alone is 49,000. Is it volume or weight? No, it's the weight. The weight of the granite used is 49,000 tons of granite. Okay. And the Vimana was built over the course of 7 years. During those 7 years, it's not like the Chola military machine has stopped. It's still going out there doing all these raids, conquests. We know this because the inscriptions tell us that such and such thing that was gifted to the temple came from this campaign of Rajaraja against that king, right? So in 7 years, not only is the Chola state moving 7,000 tons of granite every year, it's mobilizing armies of tens of thousands of men and feeding them with tens of thousands of tons of rice. Just to give you a scale of the enormous logistical apparatus required. So going back to our earlier conversation about Chola administration, that's why I think they're great administrators. Mobilizing that amount of resources is not an easy thing even for a contemporary nation state to do. For a medieval state to do it is mind-boggling, unbelievable.
And the last one about Nataraja. Now in our NCRT books, we study Nataraja Murti. We discuss the physical features of the Murti. The four hands, Jwalamala, we have Dula Hasta and all those things, Apasmara, and what is the meaning of it, all those things. We also discuss the lost wax technique, etc. But I have already presumed that Nataraj was there. It is the emblem kind of thing for Cholas from the very beginning. But how the Nataraj Murti came into being and became so central to Chola identity as such, that was another very fascinating story. And the role of the I wanted to mention the name in the very end actually, the most important queen. So can you please explain that?
Well, Sembian Mahadevi is her name, and I think in a lot of ways it is Sembian Mahadevi who is the founder of the Chola Empire. She lays down the basic mechanism of disseminating royal charisma through temples that Rajaraja Chola then takes to the next level. But the fundamental idea can really be credited to Sembian. Sembian also innovates like this architectural signature of sorts. Now, actually, you guys probably need a bit more context as to who Sambhya Mahadevi is. She is the daughter of a hill chief from Kongu, which is the western part of Tamil Nadu today. It's a hilly region. And the amazing thing about the inscriptional record from this region is that you can actually trace out individual careers, right? Simply by looking at an individual's gifts, you can know where they were, at which part of their lifetime, in which year, and how much resources they had, what gifts are they making. Symbian's first gifts are just a small herd of like sheep and goats, while her sisters-in-law are making like building like entire temples by themselves because they come from like very aristocratic backgrounds. Now, Sembyan Mahadevi's husband is a second son of the king Parantaka. His name is Gandaraditya, and he doesn't seem to have been intended for succession. There's a military disaster where her elder brother-in-law is killed, and that's how her husband becomes king. And then, unfortunately, this guy also dies very young. So Sembyan Mahadevi kind of disappears from the inscription record for a long time. And then suddenly in 973, through some internal family politics, her son Uttama becomes the Chola king. And then suddenly Sembyan Mahadevi has resources and she starts to build temples. But the way she builds temples is so brilliant to see. She concentrates a lot of temples in the Kaveri Delta area, which is where the Chola family was expanding into at the time. It's a very fertile agrarian area, so a lot of resources come in. She also selects on the frontiers of the kingdom these very selective sites. So sites that had an older sacred history or there were market towns. So when she builds a temple, people are going to see it and people are going to talk about it. And not just that, the temples themselves have a very consistent design in that there is always one particular god on the south side. And this is a god who was not very famous in the Kaveri Valley. We have no sculptures and no representations of him before Sambyan Mahadevi. And that god is Nataraja. She called him Adavallan, the expert dancer, and he was the god of a small swamp shrine called Tillai, which we now know better as Chidambaram. And because Sembyan Mahadevi picks up this god who does not have any strong local associations, the primary association is with her, Sembyan Mahadevi, and by extension with the Chola family. So when Rajaraja eventually takes a throne and he essentially turbocharges this mechanism of building temples, spreading out charisma, getting more resources, building more temples, he's also got Nataraja represented in many, many different forms. In the Brihadishwara temple, the standard weight measure is called Adavallan. So all the gifts made to the temple are specified to be in the Adavallan measure. And in fact, the main portable bronze of the temple that would have been taken on the ritual procession every day was in the form of Adavallan. So there's a very, very clear link that is drawn between Chola kingship and Nataraja. And it continues century after century. Chidambaram, over the centuries, becomes possibly the premier site of Tamil temple devotion, not just limited to the Cholas. In fact, the biggest expansions to the Chidambaram complex are made by generals and local chieftains who want to claim it and pull it away from the Cholas. So some of the biggest Gopurams were actually made by this local chap called Kopperunchinga, a really fascinating guy. I don't think we have time to talk about him. But I mean, in brief, that is the story of Nataraja. And like I think it reinforces a lot of the themes that we've been talking about this evening, in that this connection between religion and politics, between devotion and political success and resources availability. He's such a fascinating god. And the thing is that this isn't even the only case of a god being picked up and then being connected to a ruling dynasty. There are so many divinities like this. Even Jagannath, for example, like Jagannath, he begins in the 12th century as a deity associated with the Chodaganga dynasty, and then eventually he gets picked up by other later Odia dynasties, and then eventually becomes considered almost a tutelary god of Odisha by himself. And similarly, the Guhilas in Rajasthan have a similar tutelary deity. And there are so many different forms of this. I could give you dozens of examples, but really think about the history of these divinities, of these figures. There's so many layers through which we can unpack them.
The dynasties have not survived.
Yeah, but the gods have
survived. Yeah. Okay, chalo. Thank you, Anirudh, on that.
Thank you all.
Let me open the floor for you if you have any question.
Yes. We were talking about the divinity of kingship. So, as you said, the temples rose and the empires fell. So, one thing also in between the conversation we were having, that the king is of which religion? Like the king is of which religion? If he were of Hindu religion, and the population is considering him as the divine authority, then why would he have to take the help of temples in order to collect the taxes? And if he knew that the temples are becoming the new centers of power and my divinity is under threat, so why didn't he confronted that authorities of temple? Because these two things are coming in confrontation of each other.
So
Good
temple
question.
versus kings.
So the first assumption I'd like to challenge is that people actually believed all the royal propaganda. I don't think everybody did. I think that some influential people did. And whether they genuinely believe it or they believe it because it got them power and access is a question that we can't answer, but at least a possibility that we should be open to. I don't think everybody believed that the Chola kings were divine, no matter what the kings claimed, right? That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it, and I think the more interesting thing we're getting at here, is why did the kings keep making gifts to temples when the temples were actually taking away resources that could have gone to the state? And I think it suggests to us that the objectives of the state and or even our the concept of what a state is supposed to do has changed a lot over the centuries. Today, the state is expected to govern, the state is expected to provide facilities to citizens. Medieval states weren't expected to do that. If you read any medieval Dharmashastra text, and if you really look at the medieval inscriptions of kings themselves, they make it very clear that the king's job is to ensure a divine and cosmic order on earth. And that means temples have to be well provided for, Brahmins have to be well provided for, and the gods should be worshipped properly. From the king's perspective, giving away more and more land to the temple is actually fulfilling his royal duties. The idea that his state is being weakened is not, is I think a somewhat ahistorical assumption. Like, as long as the king is comfortable, as long as his generals, his political leaders, his temples are doing fine, why does he care if the peasants can't pay taxes? That's what the inscriptions show as well. There are multiple cases we know of where villages make petitions to kings saying we're being driven to bankruptcy. There's been a famine, there's been a drought, there's been a flood, we can't pay taxes, please alleviate. And the king is like, no, pay up, peasant. That's pretty much what happens. Good questions.
Sir, I actually have two questions. In our syllabus, when the topic of Indian feudalism comes, it appears with the name of the Cholas. They appear hyphenated. So, what makes the feudalism of Chola Empire unique? And my second question is regarding the Brihadeshwara temple. You said that they put a really heavy stone on top of the Vimana. So, how did they get the stone on top of it? Because there were no cranes back then.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that not having cranes bit. It's, of course, there is this legend that there's this ramp that was, I think, 30 kilometers long or whatever. But I spoke to the architectural historian George Michel, who edited the Marg volume on the Brihadishwara temple, and he did some calculations to see what is the volume of earth that would be required for such a ramp. And the volume of that would have been multiple times that of the entire temple. So it can't have been a ramp. There must have been some other mechanism they used. And I don't really think cranes was such an enormous technological innovation that somebody would not have come up with a rudimentary pulley system. If I was to guess how they did it, I would say elephant powered cranes. They probably winched it up level by level. But also the stone that's on top of the temple, very often described as a monolith. If you actually go and examine it, it's not a monolith. It's actually 8 different stones that have been locked together. So that, I think, gives a lot more credence to the theory that cranes could have been used, because it's a pretty straightforward engineering matter to winch up a 10-ton block of stone story by story compared to a single 80-ton block. What is your first question?
Feudalism.
Feudalism. Yeah. So I'm not so sure actually that Cholas are the best example of feudalism. I think that you can make a much stronger case for Deccan kingdoms exemplifying Indian feudalism, because we have, in some cases, examples of vassal and lord contracts. We know that, for example, the Pattabandha, which was essentially a little cloth band, was tied to the head of a king's vassal. We have examples of land grants being made to them, of horses being gifted to them in return for military service. What's happening with the Cholas is a lot more messy, as I described, where you have like multiple different power centers, many of which are collectively organized, with whom the king has to negotiate. So while there are systems of obligations and rights and so on that bind them to royal power, it isn't necessarily that they're receiving these as gifts from the king and have to do certain things in return. So keep in mind that if you write this in your exam, you might lose marks. So just stick with what your syllabus is saying. I'm just telling you for your understanding.
Good evening, sir. Sir, my question is what makes Nataraj sculptures so aesthetically beautiful that collectors are so fond of it? And second question is how the feudalism of Chola Empire is different or is in contrast with the feudalism of Rajputana states, which will emerge later and are emerging around that time. Thank you.
As for why, like, see, the art market is a weird and very temperamental beast. The value of objects kind of is also tied to how many exhibitions they receive, which curators are writing about them, which well-regarded sculptors have written about it. So with Nataraja especially, you had some titanic cultural figures who wrote quite extensively about this form in the 20th century. So you of course have
I think one is Kumar Swami.
Kumaraswamy, yes, the Sri Lankan gentleman. So Kumaraswamy is probably the guy who like really opens up the world to this. Just the idea that Indian sculptures could be so metaphysically complex. And then, of course, the famous French sculptor Rodin writes so evocatively about Nataraja. And given that he himself is so well regarded, his works are so valuable, his endorsement obviously skyrockets the value of the Nataraja. And of course, demand for these sculptures leads to the theft of a lot of these from Tamil temples. But the never-ending speculation and the bidding wars that ensue increase the value of the sculptures to the point where I think they're among the most valuable medieval sculpture objects you can get your hands on. As for the difference with the emerging Rajaputra system now, I think that this is actually a feature of the high medieval period. It is not limited to Rajputana. You see it across a huge swathe of not just of North India, but also in parts of the Deccan and the East Coast as well. So, for example, you have guys called Nayakas in Warangal, in the Kakatiya kingdom, who seem to be based on a similar system. And you also see Rauts or Rautas in Odisha. Similarly, sons of the king, who are essentially these local strong men who are given land in return for military service. In the Chola kingdom, you see a system instead called what's it called? Country protection is the English translation. I have to like think a little bit about what the term is that they use for it, but essentially, it's kind of similar in that certain revenue rights are ceded to a military strongman in return for providing resources to the state. But the obligations to the king that came with that are nowhere near as clear. And as I said, because it's happening at a time when the kingdom itself is in decline, these guys very quickly capture the system of temple charisma and take over the apparatus of the Chola state. So I hope that answers your question partially.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
So the Cholas had excellent navy, sir.
That question was skipped somehow.
Okay.
So it was Bay of Bengal was considered
Thank you for asking this question.
Sir,
We should have discussed this.
Lake of Chola, sir. So how did it vanish, sir? That no other kingdom, even after seeing that they were so prosperous using navy.
Yeah, I'll just add to it that government of India officially, if you go to some navy museum, they claim that the beginning of modern Indian navy is from Shivaji. And whenever I see that debate on some social media platform, people say, but Chola had navy before Shivaji. So what was this? Please explain.
So I'll ask you a more fundamental question. How do we know that Cholas had an army? When you look at the inscriptions of the Brideshwara temple, we have the names of various army regiments. We have the names of various generals. We know there was a large infantry corps. We know that there were multiple infantry regiments. We know the name of cavalry regiments. We know the name of elephantry regiments. We have depictions of guys seated on elephants. We have depictions of guys on horses. We have depictions of infantry using spears, using swords, using bows. Where are the depictions of Chola ships? Where are the names of navy captains? Where are the names of admirals? Where are the names of ships? Not a single inscription tells about any of this. And this is like I've been saying throughout this conversation, this is a polity that thrives on documentation, right? Where are the mentions? Where are the artistic depictions? Where are the literary descriptions of seafaring and so on and so forth? All our assumptions about the Chola navy boil down to three things. The first is Rajaraja Chola says he conquered the 10,000 islands of the ancient sea. Second, Rajendra Chola claims that he did all this stuff in Southeast Asia, though he only details the attack on Kedah. All the other Southeast Asian cities, it doesn't actually provide much detail. Third, there's a 12th century inscription, a place called Sirkari on the coast, which mentions an army of the seashore. All these put together, we have said the Cholas had a navy. That's a very, very low standard of evidence to come to such a shattering conclusion that they had a standing navy. There's a Wikipedia article that even gives you the names of different classes of navy ships, which, as far as I understand, are completely a hallucination. Not just that, now Age of Empires, there's a Age of Empires 4, I think, or no, Age of Empires 2 has a expansion on Rajas of India, where all these imaginary names from Wikipedia have been converted into actual units. There are multiple games now coming out that mention the Cholas that have all these names, and I can't find a single Chola period source that mentions any of that. Now, to me, it is so fascinating that neither do Chola texts nor Chola art mention a navy, but somehow we have all convinced ourselves that Cholas had a navy. I don't really think, if you look at the geopolitics of the Cholas, I don't think they had a need for a standing navy. By far, the focus of their military efforts was in the Deccan. That is the impression we get from all the inscriptions. And given the geopolitical realities of the Cholas, I don't see why they would have invested in such an expensive thing as a standing navy. In fact, when we're really critical with the evidence, the only concrete mentions we have of naval expeditions are under Rajendra and possibly under his son Veera Rajendra. To do those sporadic military expeditions overseas, you don't need a standing navy. When you already have merchants who are crisscrossing the Indian Ocean every year, and these are ships with they're like tonnages of like 150 tons. They can easily transport a few hundred guys, a single ship. You just get a few of those ships together, and keep in mind they're already designed to like transport monks, to transport merchants, to transport trade goods, to transport animals. It's a very easy thing to repurpose them to transport your armed forces, right? So why would you invest in an expensive navy when you already have this logistical capability available to you at the drop of a hat? It doesn't make sense to me, right? And if you look at the cultural memory, Tamil cultural memory as revealed by oral legends. So if you look at the Mackenzie manuscripts, which are collected by a British administrator called Colin Mackenzie, and they provide a very good snapshot of Tamil cultural memory in the 19th century. There's a lot of stuff about Chola kings being patrons of the arts, patrons of temples, occasionally murdering here and there a poet or a religious leader when they don't like him. But there's no cultural memory of overseas expeditions. To the point when the Swadeshi steamship company is set up by V.O. Chidambaram Pillai in the early 1900s, he doesn't see himself as following the footsteps of the Cholas at all. Because There's no conception of the Cholas being a naval power. All this starts first with Shastri in the 1930s, and then it's picked up by Panikkar, and then it's picked up by the diplomatic corps of independent India, because we really want to see ourselves being a big power in the Indian Ocean. And of course, now in the more muscular nationalism of today, we have simply by repetition it has become a fact. But the evidence is, like I said, very, very limited to come to such a huge conclusion. If there was a navy, all I will say is it would have left a much bigger footprint in the evidence than what we have today. Fragmentary inscriptions here and there are not the standard of evidence that we can use to come to such conclusions. If there was a navy, it will completely change our understanding of how medieval polities function. And I would be delighted to see more evidence of it, because it means that we have to rethink a lot of our understanding of the Cholas. But until the day where such compelling evidence is presented, I think we have to be open to the possibility that naval power was exerted through merchants.
I just would like to add one thing to it. See, what is the role of Navy back then? It is a time before gunpowder is used. So we don't imagine any high sea battle between the two ships. The mere function is to transport from place A to place B. And that function could have been done equally by the merchant fleet. So you don't need a dedicated navy for just transportation. Please, yes.
Hello, sir. I have two questions. You said that Symbian Mahadevi was a real founder of Chola Empire. So my question is, what was the status of women in general during Chola Empire? It is said that Vijayanagar Empire was comparatively liberal towards women, and was it the case for Chola Empire also? And second question is, you said that caste was a dominant force of institutions and all. So were there any evidences of lower caste assertion or revolts against Brahmadeya or etc.?
Both are good questions. I'm a little suspicious when claims are made about this or that medieval polity being liberal to women. I very often don't really see a lot of evidence provided for these assertions beyond this queen was important, therefore the status of women was perfect. And we have this tendency for all periods of Indian history. We look at Gargi, for example, and say, hey, the Vedic period was great for women. Just because some elite women had the ability to be a part of cultural production, to be remembered, doesn't mean that the status of all women was great. It's like saying that because Indira Gandhi was prime minister, that Indian women were all emancipated and India is a great place for women today, which we know patently and evidently is not the case, right? So we have to be very careful when we make such sweeping statements. I have to be very careful with the evidence. What I can tell you is that Chola women, members of the royal family in the early centuries, were very, very important in temple patronage. In fact, the inscriptions heavily suggest to us that the women were as active, if not more active, than the men as far as temple patronage is concerned. And in a lot of ways, the primary public facing aspect of the Chola family was thanks to queens patronizing temples like Symbian Mahadevi. But at some point in the 11th century, under Rajendra Chola, the women recede and almost disappear from the inscriptional record, the women of the family. Why? We have no clue. But gradually, the space that is ceded by the women of the Chola family is taken up by other aristocratic women from Brahmin backgrounds and from the military aristocracy. So there is a slight improvement in the status of some upper class women, but by the 12th and 13th centuries, also a lot of evidence of women of the lower castes being sold into slavery. In some cases, women of cultivator families selling themselves into slavery to be able to feed their families. So, was the status of women good or bad? Kind of depends on who the women are. Kind of depends on their social position, economic position. I can't give you a single answer to that question. As for lower castes asserting power, man, you have to understand how new of a concept that is in the broad sweep of Indian history. It is very, very recently that it has even become a theoretical possibility that an upper caste person will face legal consequences for caste-based violence. It is extremely, extremely recent. And even now, the implementation of this principle is very patchy. Even in Tamil Nadu, you keep hearing of these horrible caste-based atrocities, very often driven by so-called honor killings, which are nothing but caste pride murders. And this is ostensibly in a state that has abolished caste-based surnames at least. Lower caste assertion throughout history almost never appears in the historical record, because if it happened, it was met instantly with brutal violence. And up to very recently, you have examples where it has been tried. Think of multiple massacres that have happened in coastal Andhra, where disputes between Dalits and ruling landed caste like Kammas and Reddys instantly turned into violence, where police stood by silently, and where courts took decades to deliver justice. If that was the case in the Republic, if that is the case in the Republic of India, think about what the case was in a medieval state that didn't even have a constitution, that had no obligation to provide any rights to any of its citizens. The picture is dark and disturbing.
Anyway, chalo.
Thank you.
Thank you all. And
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.